Well, good evening and welcome to our debate tonight. My name is Scott Tomlinson. I am your evening's moderator, and we have a few people to thank for this. We'd like to first thank Reston Bible Church for allowing this to happen. These two gentlemen, I think, will put on not only a fine show, but a intellectually stimulating debate, and we're looking forward to it with great anticipation. And I think that this might end up being one of my favorite YouTube debates for this reason. On the one hand is a former atheist who has become a Christian. On the other hand is a former Christian who has become an atheist. If this were poker, everybody knows the whole cards. So this should be a good debate because no one side can say they don't understand the other side's position. So if you would do me a favor also, of course, of silencing your mobile devices and phones at this point. I'm the guy who's always guilty of that, so I'll mention that right out at the beginning. And then now let me introduce our speakers. On my left is Dr. David Wood. David Wood is a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and the Hume Society. David is a former atheist, and he became a Christian, interestingly, after examining the historical evidence for tonight's very topic, the resurrection of Jesus. He is a contributor to the books Evidence for God, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science, Defending the Resurrection, and the book True Reason, Christian Responses to the Challenge of Atheism. David has been in more than 40 moderated public debates, and he runs the website acts17.net, and he lives in the Bronx with his wife Marie and his 4 sons Lucien, Blaise, Reed, and Paley. Dr. Wood is also has some fame as well as being the man who led. I've oftentimes in our class here called Solid Ground that talks about these topics said, rarely does one argue somebody to another position, but Dr. Wood effectively argued Nabil Qureshi, who works for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, from Islam to Christianity. So it does happen, and Dr. Wood has accomplished it. On my right is John Loftus, who is a former Christian minister and apologist with 3 master's degrees in philosophy, theology, and the philosophy of religion from Lincoln Christian Seminary and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. When at Trinity, he studied under a little-known professor named Dr. William Lane Craig. And so if this man knows one of maybe the premier Christian apologists' data from the inside, this is the man you're looking for right here.
And he's a friend of mine.
And a friend. And I think John has defended him on multiple occasions and occasionally gets some flack for that
Just
as
once.
well. Okay. He's also studying for his PhD program at Marquette University in theology and ethics. He has authored 7 books in the last 7 years. He's a busy man. One of them, Why I Became an Atheist, A Former Preacher Rejects Christianity, The Outsider Test for Faith, The Christian Delusion, and The End of Christianity. And then my favorite, he co-wrote a book with Dr. Randall Rouser called God or Godless, where both a Christian and an atheist take 20 questions, and both of them answer those questions in that book from each respective side. So it's a good resource, and I imagine is on sale in the back too. Both gentlemen's books are on sale in the back. A little bit about tonight's debate. It is a question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Arguing in the affirmative, and who will go first is Dr. Wood. Arguing in the negative is John Loftus. There will be 2 20-minute opening statements, followed by 12-minute first rebuttals, followed by 8-minute second rebuttals, and then we're going to have a 10-minute crossfire question and answer period where each individual will have 1 minute to say what they wish or ask a question, and the other person to engage with that question, and then vice versa. So we'll have 10 minutes, basically 5 rounds of 1 minute each side, back and forth. After that, we'll have 5-minute closing statements, and then after the closing statements, we'll have the audience Q&A. The audience Q&A will be conducted from this microphone here to your right. And if you would be so kind, we'll give some more instructions at the Q&A time, but as we begin to line up for that, let's not begin to line up for that until the end of the last closing statement. I'll tell you when to start lining up for that. And then we do want to alternate a question for Dr. Wood, a question for Mr. Loftus, one after another each side. And then before that, I'll give a little bit more clarity on those. So without further ado, let me welcome to the podium Dr. Wood.
Well, good evening. I'd like to thank Reston Bible Church for hosting our debate tonight.
The resurrection of Jesus offers answers to more of the big questions than any other event in history. Does God exist? If so, does he care about us? Is there life after death? Do miracles occur? How can we know the true religion? Questions like that. And we had our answers to these questions when a group of women showed up at the tomb of Jesus and were greeted by an angel who said, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he has risen, just as he said." The early Christians defended this proclamation against critics, and it's an honor to carry on that defense nearly 2,000 years later. I'd also like to thank my friend John for representing the atheist position. This is my third debate with John, and his dedication continues to amaze me. I don't think Christians appreciate the sacrifice many of our atheist friends make when they spend so much of their time talking about Christianity. Anyone can understand why Christians want to discuss these issues. We believe they have eternal significance. But for atheists who are convinced that their existence ends in just a few decades, to spend those decades unwaveringly focused on Jesus and the Bible, we can only marvel that they're so generous with the little bit of time they've got. If I didn't know better, which I don't, I might think there's something spiritual going on here. But more on this later. We love you, John.
You're a good man, David.
Did Jesus rise from the dead? The short answer, yes. The long answer, yes. And having a verifiable miracle at its core is one of the most important differences between Christianity and its competitors. I find it fascinating that atheists dogmatically insist that the message of Christianity is just put your blind faith in our religion, when Christianity, more than any other worldview I'm aware of, has always said, here's how you can know that this is true. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul says to the people of Athens, tells them that God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So if Christians proclaim, here's the proof, why do atheists here just believe without any evidence whatsoever? It's as if hearing they do not hear and seeing they do not see. But for those with ears to hear, knowing that Jesus rose from the dead is actually much simpler than people realize. To know that Jesus rose from the dead, we only need to know two things. One, that he was dead, and two, that he was alive again later. If Jesus was dead and he was alive again later, I'd say that our atheist friends have a great big Son of God-shaped hole in their worldview. I doubt that John and I are going to have any disagreement on whether Jesus was dead, because we both study the sources, and Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the best established facts of ancient history. Now, the new generation of atheists who learn about Christianity primarily from websites or social media may be surprised to hear that there are historical facts about Jesus. They think of Jesus as a mythical figure, like Hercules, except that they're much angrier about Jesus for some reason. It's a tragedy of the internet age that positions that would be laughed out of the room at the scholarly level can become quite popular at the internet level by circulating among people who don't know much about a topic. At the scholarly level, Jesus mythers are thought of as along the same lines as Holocaust deniers. But at the internet level, it seems like every other atheist I run into says Jesus never existed. Really? Well, what books have you read on this? None, but I watched like 3 YouTube videos, so I'm obviously more knowledgeable than every respected scholar on the planet. Meanwhile, even some of the most critical historical Jesus scholars will acknowledge certain facts about Jesus. That he was baptized by John the Baptist, that he had disciples, that he was known as a miracle worker and an exorcist, that he believed he played a crucial role in the coming of the kingdom of God, and of course that he died by crucifixion. The scholarly consensus on Jesus' death arises from having a variety of ancient sources. There are Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources reporting Jesus' death, and knowing how crucifixion works. Today we tend to think of crucifixion as just nailing someone to a cross, but Roman crucifixion was a 3-step process. The first step was the scourging, which was sometimes called the half-death, because victims would be half dead by the time it was finished. The Romans used a flagrum made of leather thongs with chunks of bone and metal woven into the strands, designed for removing human flesh. We have records of people being beaten until their veins and arteries were exposed, or until their bones were showing, or until their intestines spilled out. Julius Caesar remarked, "It is more grievous to be scourged than to be put to death." And that was just the beginning. Step 2 was nailing the victim to a cross and letting him hang there while blood drained out of him. Once he stopped gasping for breath, the Romans knew their work was done. Almost. The Romans didn't take crucifixion lightly, so there was a third step, a death blow, just to make sure their victim was dead. If they needed to pry someone off a cross, they would smash his head in or stab him through the heart with a sword or a spear, or set him on fire, or let wild animals rip him apart. Not the sort of process anyone's going to walk away from. So Jesus' death isn't simply a point of Christian doctrine, it's a fact of history, as even non-Christian scholars are happy to admit. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the infamous Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lepid concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And as everyone's favorite scholarly critic of Christianity, Bart Ehrman, maintains, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. The real question for us tonight, then, is whether Jesus was alive again. How would we know if Jesus was alive at some point following his execution by the Romans? Same way we know many other things from history. We need witnesses, and we need to know that we can trust these witnesses. Do we have witnesses of the risen Jesus? Yes, lots. Fortunately, they began preaching almost immediately, and we have summaries of some of their early sermons. They issued official creedal statements that could be easily memorized and passed on to others. They sent out representatives with authoritative traditions that would eventually be incorporated into the Gospels and other writings. We also have writings and quotations outside the New Testament from the next generation of Christian leaders, which included people like Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who knew one or more of the apostles and who continued preaching the message of the apostles, especially the resurrection of Jesus. But the most interesting source on the eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus is an early Christian creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. 1 Corinthians was written around AD 55, and Paul says in the letter that he had already delivered the creed to the church in Corinth, which would have been several years earlier. But Paul received the creed long before that, either when he visited the apostles in Jerusalem or perhaps even at his conversion, and scholars date its formulation to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. James D.G. Dunn writes, "This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death." According to Michael Goulder, Paul received the tradition, that is, he was taught it at his conversion perhaps 2 years after Jesus' death. Ulrich Wilkins says that the creed indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Gerd Ludemann maintains that the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul Barnett dates the creed to within 2 or 3 years of the first Easter. Richard Burridge and Graham Gould say it dates from only a few years after Jesus' death. Robert Funk in the Jesus Seminar put it within 2 or 3 years at most. Richard Hayes says it originates within about 3 years after Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, and Alexander Wedderburn asserts that it goes back to the first half of the 30s. So there's widespread agreement among scholars that from across the theological spectrum that 1 Corinthians 15 contains very early material that goes right back to the original apostles of Jesus shortly after his death. Let's read the passage. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you, the Christians of Corinth, as of first importance," this is foundational information, "what I also received." Begin creed that Paul received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. Paul is writing this years later, so he adds parenthetically, "most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." The original would have ended with the appearance to all the apostles, but Jesus appeared to Paul later, so Paul adds, "and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." Notice what we have here. We have Jesus' death for sins, his burial, his resurrection on the third day, and numerous appearances And we have all of it as authoritative tradition within a few years, if not within months, of the crucifixion. As for the appearances, there are appearances to individuals, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and eventually Paul, to small groups, the 12 and all the apostles, and to a large group. He appeared to more than 500. The list also reports appearances to both friends and foes. Peter and the apostles were followers of Jesus during his 3-year ministry, but James and Paul weren't. James didn't believe that his brother was the Messiah when Jesus was preaching in Galilee and Judea, and Paul persecuted the church and tried to destroy it. Yet they're all listed as witnesses who saw Jesus alive again sometime after his death. This passage eliminates 2 skeptical responses to Jesus' resurrection. The legend hypothesis and the hallucination hypothesis. At the internet level, there are still people who claim that Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection arose through a process of legendary development over a period of many decades. But this is factually false. We know as a fact of history that the resurrection was the heart of Christian preaching from the beginning. You also may have heard people argue that Jesus' disciples simply hallucinated the resurrection appearances. But a hallucination, by definition, is something that occurs in the mind of the person experiencing it. If my friend Paul here takes a bunch of acid and a leprechaun appears to him, the rest of us aren't going to ask for his pot of gold because we're not going to see him. It's only in Paul's mind. The leprechaun doesn't exist outside of his mind. So we can't attribute the resurrection appearances to legend or hallucinations. Jesus appeared to multiple people on multiple occasions. Can we attribute them to deception? Were the disciples lying about the appearances? That's what I thought before I was a Christian. But there's a fatal flaw in the deception hypothesis. Liars make poor martyrs. Some human beings are willing to die for what they believe in. I've never met anyone who's willing to die for something he made up. In the book of Acts, chapter 4, Peter and John are arrested and threatened. In Acts 5, the apostles are put in jail and flogged. In Acts 12, James, the brother of John, is put to death by Herod, and Peter is again put in jail. The apostle Paul describes his life as a Christian in 2 Corinthians 11, 24 to 27. He writes, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. Become a Christian. It's a great life. The Jewish historian Josephus reports that James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death as a lawbreaker. Clement of Rome invites his readers to keep in mind the sufferings and martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. So the apostles didn't just preach that they had seen Jesus alive again. They were willing to endure prison, floggings, and death as they preached. And that means they really believed what they were saying. Here again, it's not just Christians who draw this conclusion. Even non-Christians maintain that the disciples sincerely believed that they had seen Jesus. Gerrit Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which he appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman, we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he had soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. Bart Ehrman again, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his crucifixion. Paula Fredrickson, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know as a historian they must have seen something. Fredrickson says she doesn't know what they saw, but I do. I think it's obvious what they saw. The disciples saw the sort of thing that would convince individuals and groups, friends and foes, that they had all seen a man who had been dead, alive again, standing in front of them, telling them why he had to die and rise again. Unfortunately for our atheist friends, the only sort of thing that can do that is Jesus actually appearing to them, which means that Jesus rose from the dead. So there's only one conclusion to draw from the facts that even atheist and agnostic scholars grant as historically certain. And yet, atheist and agnostic scholars clearly don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. Why do they reject the resurrection when they're aware of the historical evidence? Different people will give different reasons for denying Jesus' resurrection, but if you do a little digging, two broad issues emerge most frequently. First, many people have a prior commitment to naturalism. Supernatural explanations are ruled out before the investigation begins. And if supernatural explanations are ruled out prior to investigation, Jesus' resurrection is never even a candidate for belief. So, is a commitment to naturalism a good reason to reject the resurrection? As Alvin Plantinga and others have shown, naturalism as a worldview is fundamentally incoherent because it ends up undermining the cognitive faculties required to affirm it. But a more glaring difficulty, given a discussion of miracles, is the global abundance of miracle claims. In 2006, the Pew Forum issued a report titled Spirit and Power, a 10-country survey of Pentecostals, discussing statistics on Pentecostal and charismatic Protestants in the United States, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, India, the Philippines, and South Korea. And the researchers found that approximately 200 million Pentecostal and charismatic Protestants in just those 10 countries believe that they have personally witnessed miraculous healings. And that's not counting other kinds of Christians in those countries or Christians in other countries around the world. Consider miracle reports in China. According to Edmund Tang, all Christian churches in China practice some form of healing. In fact, according to some surveys, 90% of new believers cite healing as a reason for their conversion. This is especially true in the countryside where medical facilities are often inadequate or non-existent. After reviewing a number of miracle reports from around the world, Craig Keener concludes, it is no longer plausible to tout uniform human experience as a basis for denying miracles, as in the traditional modern argument. Hundreds of millions of claims would have to be satisfactorily explained in non-supernatural terms for this appeal to succeed. While many may be so explained, one cannot adopt the conclusion of uniformity as a premise without investigating all of them. In other words, those who exclude supernatural explanations prior to investigation do so by faith, not because the evidence demands it. Second, it's perhaps even more common to reject the resurrection because of what the resurrection implies. If we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, we might think it's a good idea to listen to what he says. But Jesus said all kinds of things about sin and judgment and salvation, and if we don't want to take his teaching seriously, or if we don't want to become Christians, or if we despise anything that has anything to do with Christianity, we kind of need to get rid of that whole rising from the dead thing. Now, this has always seemed like an odd approach to me. Decide what we want to believe ahead of time and then reject evidence that doesn't line up with what we want to believe. And atheists normally condemn this approach. Suppose an atheist comes to you with some kind of evidence, let's say evidence for common descent, that all human beings share an ancestor with all other organisms. If your response is, well, I don't like what that would mean, I don't like what common descent implies, so I'm going to reject any evidence you give me for it, the atheist will accuse you of being anti-science and anti-evidence and irrational and bigoted and every other thing you can think of. But then if you turn to that same atheist and present historical facts about the resurrection of Jesus, you'll suddenly find that heaven and hell and the Salem witch trials and gay wedding cakes and all kinds of other topics are entering into his evaluation of whether Jesus was dead and whether he was alive again afterwards. Feelings become the ultimate trump card. But if atheists want to bring their feelings about Christianity into a discussion of historical facts about Jesus, keep in mind that this cuts both ways. I have all kinds of feelings about atheism. Now, there's other evidence that's relevant to this discussion, and I'm sure that much of it will come out in the course of this debate. But we already have enough to conclude that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was alive again later, that friends and foes were so thoroughly convinced that Jesus had appeared to them that they were willing to endure torture and death for the privilege of proclaiming the Christian message. The question for us is, what happened? That's the question I had to struggle with 19 years ago. And I realized that apart from the resurrection, I couldn't come up with any explanation that fit the facts. By that time, I already knew that naturalism was a theory in crisis, and I didn't trust my feelings enough to deny evidence based on them. In the end, I concluded that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, and that if I'm going to listen to anyone tell me about God, it's him.
Thank you. And now we'll have a 20-minute opening statement by John.
Don't start the timer yet.
I'm running the timer, so you're all right.
All right. David. I am literally stunned. Okay. But I'm going to be nice. If that's all it takes for you to believe that somebody was raised from the dead, then you might just believe anything. You might believe that witches are empowered by the devil and think that they should be killed. You might believe, based on the Bible, that slavery is okay. You might believe that people are going to go to heaven, and so when you're in the Crusades, not knowing which ones are true believers and which ones not, just say, well, kill them all and let God decide. All right, I'm sorry. I got to get on with my talk. I can't express to you how diametrically opposed we are in our views of things. So let me get on to what I've got to say. You want to put that up? Okay. Would you do that line by line, please? Okay. I want you to think in terms of never having heard about Jesus before, never having heard about Christianity before. Now, if you had had that in mind when he was talking, if you had that in mind the very first time when he stood up and said anything, the very first time he spoke a word, and you were evaluating his case based on never hearing about Jesus, never hearing about Christianity, you would have the same view of things as I do sitting here listening to that evidence. See, most of us are raised to believe what our parents taught us, or our uncles, or grandparents in a Christian culture, mainly. And if you were raised in a Muslim culture, you would be taught differently. If you were raised in a Jewish culture, you'd be taught differently. If you were raised in a Hindu or a Buddhist culture, you would be raised to believe differently. And you would come to a debate like this, and you would hear someone defend your views, just like David did. And no matter what I said as an atheist, you would walk away and say, David just kicked butt tonight. I mean, if you were a Buddhist, you would do that. If you were a Hindu, you would do that. Because you were raised to believe a certain way, and you're looking for ways to support what you believe. You're not actually evaluating the evidence like you should. Dead people don't rise up from the dead unless there is an overwhelming, massive amount of evidence to show that they do. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just jolted once again by the lack of evidence here. And let me just go through that. Now, David wants us to believe, I want you to imagine David wants us to believe in Yingianity based on a guy named Ying, who he claims was resurrected in 4th century China. Now, you heard the statistics that 90% of the people in China think they were healed. When they are healed, they're healed, supernaturally. So that would stand to reason that China would be a superstitious country. If you approach the evidence like that, I chose Yingianity on purpose because it sounds like Christianity, and based on 4th century documents that resemble Christianity in every way. Ying was raised from the dead. He is believed to have saved the world, from their sins. He died some horrific death. And he was prophesied based on some ancient text before that. And we recently found these documents. We recently found these texts in an archaeological dig somewhere. The religion, of course, has died out. And the reason why it died out is because some guy named Mao in Beijing conquered the land and rid itself of Yingianity. So it basically went out of existence, and he established a different religion in its place. Not Yingianity, but some other kind of religion. Now, it's died out. And David's here. He's trying to convince us to believe in Ying and Yingianity based solely on 4th century documents. That is, documents that are 4 centuries old. That's twice the length of time America has been in existence. Now, let's just say we wanted to evaluate whether George Washington existed. And all we have are published results of, George Washington, when was this published? Well, 2015. What does it say he did? Well, he cut down a cherry tree. What else does it say that he was president of the United States? Well, what else? Well, he was married to Martha. What else? Well, where's the earlier sources? Well, we have little fragments here and there. Here's a little fragment here, But what did the surrounding fragment say? What did the surrounding document say? Well, we're assuming it's the same as what we have, but we don't know. We can't say that. And you wouldn't have any reason to believe that George Washington didn't exist unless you could trace it back to earlier sources, especially if there were reasons for thinking that those texts were doctored up. Okay, next. All right, now why am I asking you to do this? Why am I asking you to look at it differently? Because it's the only way to do things. It's the only way to actually evaluate the truth of your religion. Why? Because you were raised to believe this religion, weren't you? I mean, you were raised to believe as Christians. You know nothing else, most of you. You need to actually ask yourself what it would look like to be confronted with a Trinity as a Muslim, or a virgin birth as a Hindu. You need to ask yourself what it would be like to, for the very first time, hear of an incarnate God, as a Jew. You need to ask yourself all these sorts of questions because they sound bizarre. I mean, they sound bizarre when you first hear them. But because you're familiar with them, that's the only difference. That's the only difference. You're familiar with them, and so therefore they have the ring of truth to them without the evidence. Now let me get to the evidence, because that's an important thing. Okay, next slide. It's the best way to do that. Okay, next. Because we depend on familiarity. I mentioned that. We depend on our cultures. Next thing. And we seek to confirm rather than disconfirm our beliefs. Next, please. Now, here's the kicker. One more time. It would take an overwhelming amount of strong historical evidence to overcome our concrete personal experience that dead men stay dead. Now, you've never seen anybody raised from the dead. And yet you believe somebody raised from the dead based on a 4th century manuscript? Yeah, I just find that stunning, actually. I mean, I can't believe that. Next, please. Now, here's my argument. Now, you think I'm a radical. You think I'm angry. I'm not. I'm just nervous. Trust me, I'm just nervous. And I was just, really, trust me, I just am nervous. And I was stunned once again. I mean, I really was stunned. Even though I've participated in these debates for, more than a decade, to hear it all over again, it just, okay. I'm not mad. I'm a really good guy, I was just stunned, okay? Okay, I'm sure he's stunned at my views too, so I'll say that for him, right? I'll say that for him as well. My argument is this. Go ahead, click through these. Even if God exists, next. Even if miracles are possible, next. Even if yin and yang is true, next. Even if Ying was resurrected, stop. Even if there were eyewitnesses, there is no reason for us to believe that Ying was raised from the dead in China in 33 AD based on 4th century manuscripts. All of the evidence for Ying's resurrection are based on those writings that we have only as 4th century documents. You say, well, people believed it before the 4th century. Well, sure they did. Some of it, we don't know exactly what they believed. That's the point. We don't know exactly what they believed. We don't know how many times those documents were messed with. We know that Josephus, and Dr. Wood would confirm this, Josephus was tampered with. We know that. We also know that the church tampered another document called the Donation of Constantine. That's where they said, it's a great way you can lie when nobody can catch you. But they documented that the Emperor Constantine gave the Vatican the land that it now sits on. And they forged the document. We know this now because of writing samples and and samples of the parchment itself. So we know the church doctored things. We know this. There's just no reason, even if it's true, there's a lot of things that are true that we have no reason to believe. Like, there might be a criminal in this audience. There might be somebody wanted by the law. I just threw that out here. Might be a serious crime. I'm not going to say it was you. Don't worry about that. But there might be a criminal in here of a serious crime, and no one suspects you did it because the evidence isn't there. It's like that. It might have happened, but there's not enough evidence to think it did. There might be somebody might be abducted by aliens. I believe that just about as much as I believe this to be sure. And someone might actually have been abducted by aliens. But there's not enough evidence for us to believe even if he was. That's my point. All right, that's 10 minutes. Let's go. Now, here's the point. Where's the empirical evidence? Please, next. There is none. Next. Because the resurrection of Ying, or Jesus, supposedly happened in the ancient pre-scientific past in a lone part of the planet before investigative reporters, videos, and cell phones. I never shook his hand. I never held his body close to mine. I never got kissed on the lips by him. I never took off his sandals. I wasn't there to hear his words. No cell phone did either. There's no empirical evidence Jesus or Ying raised from the dead. Next, please. Where's the textual evidence? 4th century text. Just let that sink in. Next, please. They contain forgeries. The ending of the Gospel of Mark is one of them, and Mark's Gospel does not mention a resurrection. That's why when David was quoting Matthew earlier, the very first text he put up there, he had to quote from Matthew on the resurrection, because Mark never mentioned it. And neither is it mentioned in Q, the document some scholars think predated the Gospel of Mark. The resurrection of Jesus was not mentioned in either Q or Mark. It waited till Matthew to be mentioned. Next, please. No reliable external evidence to date these texts. You know, scholars are debating whether the Gospels were written in the 50 AD or as much as late as 140 AD. Luke Gospel has been dated to 140 AD. They can't date them because there's not enough evidence to know when they were dated. Well, that's like Ying's text in the 4th century in China, too. You can't date them, not very well. So how do you know how long they've been around to be doctored up? Please, next. And it excludes other early Gospels. There's all kinds of Gospels. Gospels of Peter, Gospel of Judas. I think there's a Gospel of Mary. Now, who chose to put these things in the Bible? Well, the church did. And why not the Gnostic church? Why didn't the Gnostic church get to decide our Bible? There was a Gnostic church. They didn't believe Jesus was a fleshly being. It's because the Catholic Church won the day. And when you win the day, you get to select a text that supports your views. It's true. And you can even doctor those texts. As Bart Ehrman, he quoted earlier, shows us, they changed vowels, they changed letters, they changed words, they changed sentences, they changed text, they inserted text. Some of the documents in your Bible, like 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, 2nd Peter, and 2nd Thessalonians, are forgeries. They're in there, though, because they didn't know how to determine truth from falsehood. Next, please. Where's the prophetic evidence? There is none. Now, here's going to surprise you. Here's going to surprise you. And this might be the debate. Now, there are some Jews, believers in Judaism here in the audience today. And they would verify this for me. There is no prophetic evidence that singularly points to Jesus as the Messiah from the Old Testament. None. Please. There's no prophecy of a Trinitarian God. Next. No prophecy of an incarnation. None. Next. No prophecy of a virgin birth. Next. And no prophecy of a divine dying Messiah. You're going to quote Isaiah 53 to me, but that was clearly about Israel itself. Look at Isaiah chapter 49, verse 3. Next. And no prophecy of a resurrection. This he'll agree with me about. That one, last one, he'll agree with me. There's no prophecy of a resurrection. And it seems to me that I'm going to get to what happened in a minute. Next, please. Where's the first-hand testimonial evidence? There is none. What you have is 4th century documents. Next, please. No eyewitnesses wrote anything. He'll verify that. He'll say, yeah, that's true. No eyewitness. Jesus didn't. Paul, but Paul didn't actually see. He says he saw something. Okay, we'd have to dispute that. But the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they were not eyewitnesses. We know this. Those were names attached to Gospels written later. Some scholars think that Matthew was written by a school called the Matthew School. And probably around 70, 80 AD. That's really a long time away from eyewitnesses. Next, please. We don't have a chance to question them. We can't question Herod. We can't question Ananias, Caiaphas. We don't have a chance to look, what you want to do when you examine Mormonism is you want to be able to investigate the people who said, we saw this or we didn't see this. They say, well, we saw the golden plates, we didn't, but if we ask them, what did you actually see? Let's put you in a microscope and let's put you on a stand and ask you all kinds of investigative journalist questions. We're going to try to find some inconsistencies and problems. We can't do that with the New Testament. We can't do that with the apostles. And he might point to 1 Corinthians 15 only once, but it says nothing about what they saw, if they saw anything. I mean, Paul says they did. But it says nothing about what they saw. What if they had discrepancies among their stories? Where we saw this, we saw this, we saw a ghost. One in the Gospel of Luke, it says that Jesus was seen like a ghost. What did they see? I mean, you're saying they all have the same testimony, but do they? Next, please. It contains discrepancies. When did they arrive at the tomb? What time of the day? Who rolled the stone away? Actually, Luke disputes Matthew. Matthew says that the guard at the tomb was placed there to guard so that nobody would be able to steal the body. And then Luke comes along. He says, I've investigated everything, and I want to write down most orderly what actually happened. He says that in the first chapter, the first 3 verses. He says, I'm going to write down what exactly happened. And he left out the story of the guard at the tomb. That means, folks, Luke didn't agree with Matthew's story of the guard at the tomb. It doesn't make sense anyway. Next, please. Shows evolutionary growth. The stone becomes a big stone, then becomes a new stone, then becomes a heavy stone. The other things like that. Next. Oh, right. Don't forget the last one. Visionaries. Like the Mormons, like the growth of the Mormon church, it started with the people who saw visions. There's a different kind of people that we don't understand. They're superstitious people. They have dreams, and they see things, or they think they see things, and these are people. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that he learned about the Lord's Supper from a vision. He also says in Galatians 1 that he did not receive 1 Corinthians 15. He says, I did not receive any tradition from those early apostles. So that is either a contradiction, or we've got to go through that. And the first 2 chapters of Revelation, the book of Revelation, the revelator, John, says he heard a vision from on high, Jesus. Jesus was talking to him, and he dictates 7 letters to the 7 churches. Now, who among us would actually believe someone who said, I heard a vision, I saw a vision, and Jesus was talking to me, and I wrote down 7 letters to 7 churches in this area, and sent them by horseback if you want. And here, you can have your letter from Jesus, because of my vision, and here you can, and you're the lukewarm church. Not you, but you over there, you're the lukewarm church. And I had this vision, you see, and Jesus said he's going to spit you out of your mouth. Here, and would you really accept that? Well, these are visionaries, folks, and these are visionaries. Visionaries have the ability to see things that didn't happen, and you're calling them good witnesses? Next, please. Where's the corroborative evidence? None. Where's the corroborative evidence that there was an earthquake, or that there was an eclipse, or that the saints came out of the tombs and roamed the streets of Jerusalem as Jesus was resurrected from the dead? No account of it at all. Oh, I'm sorry. Philo must have missed that. You see, Philo lived and worked and rode through the lands of Palestine, and he didn't record any of that. Really? The saints? David, Solomon, the prophet Elijah, Isaiah, roaming the streets, and Philo never makes a mention of it. Now, David's friend Michael Licona doesn't believe that happened. And I support that. I agree with him on that. But it makes the whole story incredible. Just think if you're interviewing somebody to know whether to put them on a stand in a trial, and the person breaks out and says, I see Jesus up there, or I see blood on the wall, or I see something incredibly crazy, or I feel like ants are crawling all up my body. It discredits the entire testimony to find that in the Gospel of Matthew. Next, please. I mentioned those. Next. Done. Jews. Final argument. There were 8 million Jews in the time of Jesus. And according to Catholic biblical scholar David Sim, who looked at the evidence and the censuses that were taken of those days and eras, and what were written about the numbers of Jews that were at the time, 8 million of them, 7 million living in the known world, 2.5 million living in Palestine. They were beloved of God. They believed in God. You can't call them atheists, you see. Woo! Got that off our backs. They believed in miracles. They believed in all the miracles of the Old Testament. They hoped for a Messiah. They knew their Old Testament prophecies, but they didn't believe. A lot of them. Now, you can claim they got their Old Testament prophecies wrong all you want, but then who wrote them? Who supposedly inspired them? Who predicted the events, whatever they were? That would mean that God purposely misled them. Their choices are, the Jews, 8 million of them, 2.5 living in the area, were incredibly stupid people, not to know their prophecies. Incredibly evil people, not wanting to believe their prophecies, or that God misled them about the prophecies. I already said there was no prophecy about a resurrection, right? There isn't. Well, that would mean he condemned them to hell too, and to all of the problems that they've suffered at the hands of Christians who view them as Christ killers. One more, please. Would you believe in Yingianity with this non-evidence if it was defended by Ying apologists, where 80% of them rejected the sufficiency of historical evidence? There's a first part of this presentation I didn't go into, and I talk about apologetical methods, and I'm done. But 80% of Christian apologists reject the evidential method of apologetics in favor of classical apologetics or presuppositionalism or faithism or something like that. So 80% of Christians reject the sufficiency of historical evidence, and these are the reasons why. Sorry if I was a little nervous, but that's, I was just, okay, thank you, bye.
That concludes our two 20-minute opening statements. Now we will have 8-minute rebuttals from each side. 12-minute rebuttals. We will have 12-minute rebuttals from each side. Let me reset my counter, and he is exactly right. Terrific moderator tonight.
John.
David.
What are you apologizing for?
Oh, I got a little...
Now, if you want to apologize for saying you're shocked, you could do that, because I'm the one who is shocked. I was really expecting John to go through the evidence. Instead, John decided to adopt an extremely skeptical position, and we'll go through that a bit. But John asks us to imagine that we had never been raised to believe in Christianity. I wasn't. My dad told me he was God. And just to be clear here, here's my friend Guillaume Bignon. He's a former atheist. My wife was an agnostic when she examined the evidence. My friend Nabil was a Muslim when he examined the evidence for the resurrection. We all came to believe in the resurrection. So if it's simply a matter of pretend you weren't raised to believe this, several of us don't need to pretend this, and we came to believe. Apart from that, notice, I sort of took this as far as I could take it. John's little test, imagine you're not a Christian. Imagine you're not raised to be a Christian. Imagine you're outside of Christianity or something. Notice all of the facts that I base my case on. I quoted non-Christian scholars. Scholars who specialize in this field, scholars who, despite not being Christian, have dedicated their lives to examining this material, and they agree. And why is that important? Because John, it seems, just thinks we can't know anything. Right? We're basing our beliefs on 4th century documents. Well, why do these people who examine the ancient manuscripts conclude that we can know facts about Jesus with absolute certainty, that we can be certain that he was historically certain, not mathematically certain, but historically certain, that Jesus died by crucifixion, or that we can be historically certain that his disciples were convinced that he appeared to them? Why do they say these things? Are they stupid? Have they not learned? Have they not heard John's message about Yingianity? No, because they look at the manuscripts and they understand how textual criticism works, right? They understand, hey, we've got manuscripts over here from Europe. We've got manuscripts across northern Africa. We've got manuscripts over here. We've got fragments going back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And we have records from the early church fathers who are quoting these passages. And these manuscripts spread so far and so fast that when you change them, you can spot. John says, but there are additions and they're right. How do they know? How do scholars know that something is an addition? Because if you're a scribe writing in the 6th century and you write something and you're in the Middle East, that difference doesn't show up in Europe. That difference doesn't show up in Egypt. So you can spot them. I believe it was Daniel Wallace who told me that if you piled up our manuscripts that we have, it would stretch to over a mile high. And we look at this, and it seems that, let me put it this way. If you're going to say, we can't know because we're looking at manuscripts and not the originals, according to John, we can't know what Plato taught, we can't know what Aristotle taught, we can't know what Homer said, we can't know any of these things. And just to be clear, that is so radically skeptical. We know almost nothing about ancient history. We wouldn't know anything unless you find an archaeological monument or something like this that was built right when it happened or something like that. And so this is a kind of radical skepticism. Why would John adopt this approach when it's rejected by almost everyone, Christian or non-Christian? Why would he adopt this approach? Because you have to, right? You have to. If you want to avoid the resurrection, you can either state your biases or you can adopt an extremely skeptical position. Because if you just go with the facts, again, even the facts that are agreed upon by very critical scholars, it kind of looks like Jesus rose from the dead. And when I say kind of, I mean it's the only thing that actually fits the facts. So, what we agree on, I'm not sure exactly what we agree on because I haven't heard John sort of explain the evidence. Keep in mind, we have evidence, right? If John is saying that every expert, every respected scholar who examines these issues is wrong, that we know about Jesus' death, if he's saying that every scholar is wrong, that we know what the Apostle Paul believed, that Paul converted, that the apostles believed, that they were convinced that he had appeared to them risen from the dead, if John is saying we don't know any of this, then keep in mind I'm going to allow him to modify his position. But, if we go through the debate and it's just skepticism, skepticism, skepticism all the way down without ever actually accounting for any of the facts that we actually have, not sure how far we'll get tonight. Documents. Again, John says we base our Christian belief on 4th century documents. We certainly have manuscripts earlier than that. But again, if the Bible starts getting translated in the 2nd century and the 3rd century and so on, you have full-blown copies by the time you get to the 4th century. But no one in the field of textual criticism is so skeptical that they say you can't figure out what earlier manuscripts said. Even if you go with all the differences, keep in mind there are lots of differences. If you're copying something by hand, there are going to be differences. But if you talk about the differences that actually matter, the differences that can go back to the original, and the differences that are actually meaningful, it's not just a spelling difference like spelling John with one N or two N's. There's almost nothing, and even Bart Ehrman would agree there's nothing that would affect any major Christian doctrine that would cause you to believe that a major Christian doctrine like the resurrection or the deity of Christ is false. You go back in time, looking at all the manuscripts, you never find a Jesus who didn't die on the cross or who didn't rise from the dead. You just don't find that sort of thing. So if you're saying that we just don't know you're saying textual criticism doesn't work. You can have all the manuscripts. You can have 5,800 plus Greek manuscripts, and you can just never figure out anything with any degree of certainty. Wow. So this would come down to if you're that skeptical, then yes, you might as well reject Christianity. But if you're that skeptical, you might as well, believe you're not even here right now and you're seeing some sort of hallucination or something. Discrepancies in the Gospels. John says Luke didn't agree with the story of the empty tomb because he left it out. I don't know if you noticed, but if you notice, Matthew, Luke, John, and Acts are all about the same length. Why is that? Was that just random that they're all about the same length? No, that's back in the day, before we had books. Right now you can make books as big as you want. But back then, you wrote on scrolls, right? And the maximum length of a scroll that you could get is about the length of Matthew, Luke, and John. For some reason, Mark wanted his a little bit shorter. And Acts. But there's a reason. You have a limited amount of text. So if you wanted to include certain stories and certain miracles, you had to leave other things out. And so it's just a very interesting method to say if one writer includes something that another writer doesn't include, it's because the other writer rejects it and believes that story is false. And that's just silly. Everyone's dealing with material that they have to sift through and say, what am I going to include? What am I not going to include? So to say Luke didn't believe there's a guard at the tomb because he doesn't list it, well, Luke has a full gospel as is. If he includes it, then you'd have to start part 2, and carrying around 2 scrolls is going to upset a lot of people. He said that the Gospels show evolutionary growth. This is another common approach among atheists, and that to say, look, here's a story, and here's a story that tells more, and here's a story that tells even more. Therefore, there's an evolutionary process. They're inventing it as they go along. I actually showed in an article in responding to Dan Barker, where he advocates this about the resurrection stories. You can put the Gospels in any order you want, and then pick out the stories where one has more detail and say, you see, it's an evolution, it's a growth, right? Now, if you can put them in any order and say, you see, they're inventing the story as they go along, that means you're just picking and choosing which stories different writers added more detail to. And if you want to go that route, notice the most appearances that we have of any source happen to be our earliest source, the 1 Corinthians Creed that I quoted. This goes back to within just a couple years of the crucifixion. This is not according to me. This is according to just about every respected scholar writing on this topic. We quoted a bunch of them. They all agree. Why does John think we have no clue? We have no idea when any of this is from? Because he's being more skeptical than every respected scholar on the planet. And again, if you're going to be that skeptical, carry it through to its logical conclusion. 1 second. John,
no, not that.
John says
not that.
John says that Mark doesn't include a resurrection, and that's why I had to include. That's why I had to quote from Matthew, because there's no resurrection in the Gospel of Mark. It's thought by many, it's not agreed upon, that the original Gospel of Mark ended at verse 8. But let's look. Entering the tomb, chapter 16, verse 5, entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him." That's verse 6. That's in the Gospel of Mark. So certainly includes a resurrection there. John complains that we exclude the other early Gospels. Well, this is hilarious. He mentions the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Mary. These start around the middle of the 2nd century. Right? By the way, raise your hand if you've read the Gospel of Judas. I read that thing. Sounds like it's written by aliens, doesn't it? Right? Sounds like it's written by aliens, just the terminology, and that's because it's based on Neoplatonic Greek philosophy, right? They're talking about the pleroma of this, and it's clear that 1st century people were not talking like this. And if you go through, why don't we think what John is saying? Why don't you include the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century books that are clearly not do not go back to the original disciples of Jesus? Why do you do that? Why do you prefer Gospels that are 1st century documents and that go back, either written by the apostles? I believe that John was there for the Gospel of John, that Matthew wrote Matthew, and so on, or to people working very closely to them. Why do you want to do that? I mean, think about these questions. Why do you go with the 1st century instead of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century? I don't know, because one is actually connected to Jesus and the others aren't. I don't know. He says that the resurrection is not mentioned in Q. Well, the Q, there's no Q anywhere. There's no official Q document, but Q is a sayings document. It's the sayings of Jesus, right? It's not the history of Jesus, right? So if it's a collection of Jesus' sayings, it obviously isn't going to include the narration of his resurrection, because it's a collection of his sayings, if it's anything. John says Isaiah 53 refers to the nation of Israel. The suffering servant dies for the sins of Israel, as a sacrifice for the sins of Israel, and so it would be weird if it is the nation of Israel. It says no prophecy about the resurrection. I would invite John to read Acts 2 and Acts 13, where the apostles use one. Now, John adopts the method of a modern atheist reading these texts. I'd invite him to use the method of an 1st century Jew in reading the text. Get a different outcome.
Thank you, David. And now for John's 12-minute first rebuttal.
I'll be nicer this time, I promise. I'm just usually that way. I would run down a few things. He had mentioned Q, sayings. I'm going to start back there. Well, then where the I mean, that was the earliest, supposedly. It's not actual documents, what they've surmised might have existed from looking at the comparisons of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so why aren't there any events, described? He says it's a sayings gospel. It was first. If it, that's what they assume it exists. But there's no events. Who included the events? And there's no resurrection in there. And Mark does end by someone in white clothes that I don't think we know whether it's angels or just people in white clothes saying he's not here, he's risen. Oh, that'll satisfy me. Yeah, that does it. That's perfect. Have somebody sit there and says he's risen. Is that all the evidence people need? So no, there's no resurrection appearance in Mark. There's no touching, seeing, feeling thing. That was added later in Matthew's gospel. As far as the gospels of Judas and Peter, the 2nd century, sure, yeah. There are scholars who date Luke at 140, the 2nd century, and the gospel of John is 2nd century. But obviously those gospels are original from somebody important, certainly not the apostles. We know that. We know those gospels were not written by the apostles. We know that. But apparently Judas and Peter don't count just because they're not in they're not in the present Bible. And apparently we know how they concluded those sorts of questions, and which I don't. Now, he mentioned something about Luke and the scrolls, how long the scrolls were, and Luke obviously didn't have the room to put the guard story in his gospel because he had other more important things to write about. I want to be the first atheist debater ever in the world to say this. I don't know about that. Maybe you're right. I'm not doing this sarcastically. I'll have to look into that, although I doubt it. Scrolls can come in different lengths, but what do you mean? They all had the same length of scroll? That initially sounds odd to me. That's all. I don't have the facts to dispute that. Okay? But I will say this. The story of the guard at the tomb as told in Matthew's gospel is ludicrous. That's why Luke probably wanted to not include it. Here's why. It says that the guard at the tomb was placed on at the tomb where Jesus was supposedly was buried, and I accept that he died. I'm not questioning everything. I'm questioning the resurrection. Okay, not everything. That the guard was posted on Saturday, the day after Jesus died. It gave the disciples plenty of time to steal the body if they wanted to. It's just a flawed cover-up story. And that when the angels came by, the guards fell to the ground, blinded and like dead. Oh yeah, I'm going to tell you what happened after that. Yeah. Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah, I saw it clearly through my death stupor coma. The story itself is implausible. The guard at the tomb. And then they're going to go to their leaders, which would have been Pilate, not the Jews. And they would have told Pilate, hey, Pilate, guess what? The disciples stole the body. Dang them. I can't believe that. I don't see that happening myself. I just don't see it happening. If they actually saw Jesus rise from the dead, you know what I would do? I'm leaving town. I'm hijacking out of here, But no, I'm going to go tell Pilate because he just might kill me. So the story itself lacks plausibility, all in and of itself. So it stands to reason Luke wouldn't want to include it. Now, just some things. By the way, I like David. I consider him my friend. I'm just sorry that he wanted to get beaten again, as he did the first two times, which is just rhetoric, of course, supposed to lighten the mood, but it doesn't always work. Now, you mentioned something about historically certain. This is historically certain. Bart Ehrman says that. I can't believe he says that. I just can't believe he says that. There is nothing historically certain. Nothing. Some things have more or less probability to them, and we should think exclusively in terms of probabilities. And if we think exclusively in terms of probabilities, then there's no room for faith. Flip a coin. It's going to come up 50% heads, 50% tails. Oh, I'm sorry, I have faith. It doesn't change the odds. Now, I had no prior commitment to naturalism either, David. I believed, I studied, I preached 14 years. I taught in Bible colleges. I was a budding apologist. I had no prior commitment to naturalism, and you know this. I would think that God, if he exists, would pay particular good attention to me, too. Back in those days, especially if he had foreknowledge. He would have said, you know what? John Loftus, I better make sure he doesn't leave the fold. I mean, I better make good sure. Sorry, I really am sorry. I better make good and sure he doesn't lose his faith. Like the parable of the lost sheep. I mean, if there's a lost sheep I better go after him because he's writing all these books and he's debating all these people. I better make sure it doesn't happen. I don't care what it takes. I might even snap my fingers and take away his critical thinking capacity so that he will believe even though the evidence is against what he believes. Because I'm sovereign that way. I can do that just like I did to Saul on the Damascus Road. Saul, he was, of course, a persecutor of the church, and somehow he was able to change Saul's mind without abrogating his free will. And if he could do that once, he could do it more than once. Why not me? That's if he cared. That's if he existed and if he cared. Now, unsettling conclusions. You said that, unsettling implications. I want to believe, David. You know why? I'll be honest, there was a not too long ago, I was facing some difficulties. I said, I'd like to cry out to God. True story. I can't. He doesn't exist. Oh, dang. Serious. I mean, I want to believe that there's a guy up in the sky that can take care of me when I'm in need. I really do. And as far as those ethical obligations that you say I don't want to obey, well, I suppose you don't want to be a Jainist then either. I suppose you're rejecting Jainism because they don't eat live fruit. They wait till the fruit drops on the ground before they eat it, right? Oh, those ethical obligations are too great for me. I can't abide by them, so I'm going to reject Jainism. No, that's not the ethical obligations we're talking about. We're talking about kind of more serious ones that we just are really opposed to. Oh, as far as Jesus mythers go and the scholarship, it's changed. Richard Carrier has written a book called The Historical Jesus, the Quest for the Historical Jesus. It's published by Sheffield Press in 2014. I am not a Jesus mythist myself. I mean, I do believe that there was an apocalyptic Jesus who existed, somewhat, at least for now, I think that. But that book is now put the Jesus mythicist position on the boards because Sheffield Press is the major Christian scholarly press when it comes to biblical studies. And it's a big book. So they're taking that position seriously now. Just keep in mind that all he does is quote from 4th century texts. I want you to consider the Mormon Church, Scientology, if you will. Don't you want to get to the source of, let's say, the Mormon Church? Don't you want to know about it? And let's say all you knew were their writings. That's all you knew, the Mormon Church's writings. Now, they hide some of them, of course. They don't want you to see some of them, but that's all you knew. There weren't investigative reporters back then. And I would want to ask Peter, the apostle, I would want to ask him, what did you see? When did you see it? Why did you see it? Were you really with him? What did you hear him say? What did you hear him teach? Did you actually see him rise from the dead? I mean, and then I would ask each of the other disciples. And maybe one of them recanted their testimony. Maybe they were named and that never testified before anyway. We just don't know that. Paul says so. He says so to the Corinthian church, which is half around the Mediterranean Sea. Not easily attained, not easily gotten to. He writes a letter, and these people say, saw this. There's no way to check that. But he includes the testimony of 500 anonymous people in that listing of people who saw Jesus. 500. That's an odd number. But why not 501? Why not 499? No, 500. 500 because that's how many there were. I counted them. Doesn't that undercut the credibility of the story itself when you throw in a number like that? I'll just throw in 500. It sounds like a good number of people. And we do know that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul was talking about visions. They're visionary people. And he says, I saw Jesus in a vision. In Acts chapter 26, verse 19, he says that before King Agrippa, I think. He says it was a vision. He says my Damascus Road trip was a vision. Of course, how could he have seen Jesus when it says he was blinded? And anyway, how do you know it was Jesus? By his own testimony. So he says these other people saw Jesus in the same way in 1 Corinthians 15. So there just really isn't any evidence. I mean, no corroborative evidence, no eyewitness testimony. All we have is 4th century documents from, just think of Ying and Ying Yanny, and you really shouldn't believe. Sorry if I've used up more of my time or beat up on him too much. Thank you so much.